Ladies and gentlemen, I am very, very pleased. I am very pleased. All right. To give you the next panel and its moderator, Mark Stahlman, who is the co-founder and director of the Center for the Study of Digital Life. He will hopefully say a word or two, but not three, about that.
That's fine. That's fine. But we're going to run this panel more like a graduate seminar than a series of lectures. And so therefore I want all of my panelists to be down front here so they can talk to each other. So you don't need to face the audience. You can face any way you wish, but please be down in front here so you can talk to each other. Thanks very much to Ellie for inviting me to moderate this panel. Columbia's long been a favorite of mine, and in particular the statue of the great god Pan, which is probably one of the most interesting public sculptures in New York. If you haven't seen it, it's hiding behind a bush right over there. The man who did that is the one who built the collection that is now called the Cloisters. If you've ever been to the Cloisters, I recommend that to all the out-of-town people. His name was George Bernard Gray. The intersection between innovation, culture, psychology, and economics that comprise society is not the subject of study by anybody. This is a very fundamental problem, and we're going to try to tackle aspects of that today. I recently met a woman who went to USC with a master's degree and wanted to get a PhD in sociology on the impact of technology on society. And the sociology department at USC said, "Dear, you're in the wrong building. The engineering building is over there." It turns out that we are simply not asking the right questions. To treat technology as exogenous to economics, and there are, by my count, 10 PhDs in economics on the agenda here, is a cause for fundamental failure. I asked my panelists to take a look at the recent publication called Rewriting the Rules, published by Joe Stiglitz. Has anybody in the room read this 111-page report? I know what I'm doing, thanks. Everybody's not going to talk for 15 minutes. They're going to talk for 5 minutes if they need to, okay? That's how it's organized. It's a seminar. This is not a series of lectures. It turns out that there's one place on Earth where all of these factors are being put together, and that is not here. That is China. And I'd be happy to talk with any of you afterwards about a major new project I'm embarking on called the China Operating System Project. We believe over the past 15 years, the Chinese Communist Party has been designing an operating system for society. That's really quite unimaginable in our lives, but makes a great deal of sense for them. I'd be happy to talk with you in the break, obviously, about any of that. We're going to begin here with Annabelle, who's coming to us from London. Annabelle, please summarize your comments.
Good afternoon.
Yeah, go ahead.
Good afternoon. Thanks for inviting me to participate in this panel.
Hello.
Can you hear me all right? Okay. And I was asked by Mark to start the panel, if I may, with some fundamentals of the internet economy, and I want to talk specifically about platforms as a new form of organization that affects the way firms compete and individuals and firms innovate. So next slide, please. Yeah, I can't really see which slides you have up there. So there should be a slide there called Platforms Example.
Yep, it's good.
Yeah, okay. So we have seen over the past few years an explosion of the number of platforms around us, such as, for example, Google or LinkedIn and social media, Facebook, Twitter, Waze, obviously the iPhone and its ecosystem of app developers, recently Airbnb, Alibaba in China. These companies who did not exist until very recently have become very large, very powerful in a record period of time. So if we look at the way they are designed, if we put sort of a design or engineering hat on us, we can see that they are designed as building blocks on top of which other products and services are plugged in. And I'm going to speak a little bit later about the technological structure of these platforms, and in particular about the role of interfaces or connectors. You see here I put a Lego block as because a lot of these platforms are a building block on top of which other products or services are developed. Let me move to the next slide. So I propose that making technologies, products, or services foundation on top of which an array of firms, but more and more an array of individuals that are together organized in something that we can call an innovation ecosystem. They develop a set of interrelated products, technologies, and services. And we can think about mobile phone operating systems or video games or internet itself as a giant platform. Next slide, please. When platforms emerge, they affect industry dynamics in specific ways. Oftentimes, positions of industry leadership get challenged. The structure of the industry changes itself, and it moves from either tightly controlled supply chain towards loose coalition of complementary. Sometimes you even see this going back, where you have some degree of integration into diversified ecosystems that start to coalesce and go back towards more integrated systems. So the nature of competition changes, moves away from system-based competition towards component-based competition. But probably one of the most salient phenomena that we see is that instead of having competition between isolated firms, we have competition between coalitions of firms. If you think about Google and Android ecosystem versus iPhone and its Apple ecosystem, you have an understanding of what I'm talking about. If we think about innovation, we see a lot of innovation focusing on complements to existing platforms. So a lot of emphasis on complementary innovation. Now that has an interest if we think in terms of employment, but it's not very simple, the effect. And because the theme here is in employment, I want to address that right away. A previous speaker spoke about lowering of barriers to entry, and it's true that in terms of barriers to entry into industries of complements to these platforms, the barriers to entry are much lower. People don't need to reinvent the whole system to be able to compete in these markets. They can come in as a developer of complements. And in particular, when the availability of skills in software development becomes more widespread, and with the can you hear me?
Yeah, you just dropped out.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Because I saw on the live stream something different, so I thought it was at the same time. So in the context of a widespread, diversified skill base of software development, and where you have pervasive connectivity through the internet, which is global, that lowering of the barrier of entry becomes quite effective. For firms, it also creates new strategic opportunities in order to try to capture the value created by these more autonomous developers who can develop complements on the basis of the platform. So move to the next slide. Can you hear me now?
Yep. There's a delay on the slides. It shows ongoing platform bugs. This is why we don't. Nope, she just disconnected.
That was a Skype freeze.
It's not me. Yeah, let's move along. Mark, we move to the next. Yeah. She's not connecting anyway. It's her. She's got no service on her end.
Good. Moving on means, in this case, asking the other panelists to make a few comments about what they've just heard from Annabelle in seminar style. By the way, at the end of this, if there's any time left, the whole audience will have a chance to be a part of the seminar. But we have 3 other panelists here. You've heard the basic, you've seen the work of Annabelle. Any comments? Even if she can't hear us? Comments?
I don't see it has anything to do with the topic of the conference, which is about the effect of internet on jobs. I didn't hear the word jobs.
Can you talk into the microphone?
Yes,
right
can.
in front of you. Yeah.
I just said I didn't see what it had to do with the topic of our panel. That's all.
But I'd agree with her, though, that the platforms is an interesting idea. This has been a way to look at strategic intent and strategic development. I think what's beginning to happen as a result of the development of things like the Internet of Things and some of the technology innovations I'll talk about is that it's the platform strategy is really being challenged. So the ability of platforms to be involved in in employment generation, I think will change quite a bit in the next few years.
I think it's an important, but a lot of people look at something like a Google and say that's the fundamental problem with the internet economy because Google, billions of dollars and they have like 8,000 employees, so they look at it as a dollars per revenue of Google as somehow that shows that the internet doesn't produce jobs, but that's just wrong because Google's the plumbing. It's like looking at all the utilities in the U.S. and saying they only employ 0.1% of the population. And so, my God, where have we gone wrong since indoor plumbing was invented? So I think platform competition is very important, but it also shows that a lot of people look at these firms as somehow the jobs have got to be there, but it's not there. It's the things that they enable.
We're not going to get Annabelle back, so can we move on to the second presentation, and then some discussion amongst us. Len, would you like to pick it up here? Thank you.
That's not the one. You sure that's the one I just gave you?
This one you just gave me, Joe.
No, it's not. Okay. I spent the month of April here at Columbia Business School with my wife, Eva Klein, who's talking this afternoon. And when Lorenzo and Ellie asked me to look at this, I said, well, I'm going to start off because I don't know much about it. And I got into this literature. I didn't realize till about a week later, this is the largest part of labor economics research in the last 10 years. So I said, oh no. And so I think the hollowing out of the middle class is just the wrong phenomenon to be looking at. Because when you look through the data, and I won't go through all my slides, you can see them all later, is the middle defined as 75% to 125% of the median income level has been hollowed out since we have data. It really is just shifting people moving in and then moving out, depending on the technology waves. So this is from Wells Fargo. It shows you the middle class decreasing, and growth in the high income, high skilled, and low skilled. So this is the last, or latest of these papers. Hi, Annette. Is by Joinovich and Sue. It's late in 2014. So this is the way they look at it. These are 3 time periods: 81, 91, 91, 2001, 2001, 2011, and it's now called routine bias technical change. When I went to school, it was just technical bias technical change, then skill-based technical change, and now we've now turned to, as we've heard, routine. So the routine jobs that we've shown have been losing, and we have non-routine manual. Non-routine manual are hospital orderlies. It's manual labor, low paid. This is low paid on this side, which they do it on the other side. But it's non-routine. That is, at the moment, you can't have a computer or the internet do that job. Routine is not low skill. You know, for whatever the literature says, if you look at who the routine jobs that we're losing are both bank tellers and lawyers. Now, last time I looked, lawyers were not exactly low paid or middle class. But because LexisNexis, an internet, does replace, searching through cases, lawyers are not as plentiful as they once were, which according to some people is a good thing. I don't know if there are any lawyers in the room, so I won't take it any further. And also because because the internet allows you to have somebody in Bangladesh do your stuff at night while you're sleeping, there are less jobs for lawyers in North America. Non-routine cognitive are all of us. Hopefully we're not going to be replaced soon. And so that's the job polarization literature looks like that. But when you look at it in more detail, this is a paper by, which this is not my latest version. So when you look at high wage, and the biggest growth since '59 is in managers and professionals. And if you look at the low wage, where the losses have, where again there's growth, it's food preparation, buildings, and grounds cleaning. I don't know what it has to do with routine. And in the middle, where the job losses have been, production, craft, and repair, the fact that assembly lines have moved from Canada to Mexico, I don't know, that has nothing to do with the internet. And so the problem, I think, is this: we're using, as the OECD is using, 2-digit job classification. And that is a problem because you can't analyze this properly at the 2-digit level. You have to go to 4-digit level, and you have to have more refined analyses of all these. I won't do the Canadian one. And also, as I said, polarization is just not a new phenomenon. Lester Thoreau talked about it in the 80s. Simon Kuznets talked about it in the 50s. So the middle class has been disappearing since at least the 60s, which is, to me is somehow an error. And there are multiple causes. Or are we defining the middle properly? I don't know. I think there's a lot of work to be done to define the issue. So this is the main paper by Goose and Manning called Lousy and Lovely Jobs, which go through this routine stuff. But when you look at Canadian data, rather than US data, so you can see here the polarization index is is the only correct way of measuring this issue at a macro level. It has nothing to do with Gini coefficients. You have to really look at defining it as the 75 to 150% of the median and do various ways of dealing with the data. So you can see with the rise of the internet, let's call that 95. I don't know, what would you call it? 95. 95? You can see in Canada, if you're looking at, here's the middle class as defined in Canada. By every statistic, you see that, has there been any decline? So is this a U.S. story? And is it a U.S. story because when I look at this, so here's the income top shares in Canada, 1920 to So here's another part of the story is the rise in the really rich. Well, here's the really rich in Canada. 42% don't have a bachelor's degree. Wow. Finance is 10% of the number of individuals. So, in fact, professional, scientific, and technical are 50% as big as the finance guys. So, medicine is 8%, and veterinary. So it's a much more complicated story than, the pay of CEOs and the rise of somehow some Uber, I guess that's a good term to use. And in the US, you have something which you don't have in any other country, which is, the rise in the top 1% in the US is also due to the explosion of IPOs. So it's not that everybody's gotten relatively less, it's just you have enormously wealthy people, because we don't have any IPO, well, we have a couple lately, Spotify and others in Canada, but we don't have the wave of the really rich that have been created by this. So maybe it's not even a problem in the US, because we're looking at this as a relative issue, not the fact that the US is the country that's gotten much better because of this, because they have the Googles and the Ubers and everything. So I'm not convinced that there's job polarization. I know that's the topic. And I can't see why the internet is the cause, because to me, it's too complicated a story to get there. Oh, quick.
We're doing fine with time, by the way. Our hard stop is the 12:30 with Jeff Sachs. So we have 40 minutes between now and when we have to stop. The other two panelists here maybe have some thoughts. You've seen Len's slides. You know his conclusions.
Yeah, I wanted to underline Len's emphasis that we should be here to talk about technology in general, not about the internet specifically. Many of the job losses in the middle that cause that hollowing out in the middle on his slides were due to a continuation of a decades-long process of automation replacing manufacturing workers. And automation itself is not internet-based automation. It's things like robots welding together parts in auto plants and painting the bodies so that people don't die of fumes from auto paint. It's not all a bad thing to replace some of the least pleasant jobs by robots. But that's what we're talking about here. Much of that carving out in the middle has nothing to do with the internet at all. You've got three things going on: automation, globalization, that is the moving of the plants away from the northern US to the southern US, to Mexico, and to further countries abroad. And then finally, you have the internet with a classic example of everybody at Borders lost their jobs because Amazon did a better job of selling books than Borders. So I think we should broaden out the concept of what's causing job losses here as a general theme of the conference.
And I think it's important to differentiate between impacts from automation and impacts from the internet. That a lot of people have looked at the second machine age and essentially conflated its conclusions with what's happening with the internet. And I think that that's very unfair, and I think that it's due to the fact that when Brynjolfsson and McAfee did their book, they basically focus on automation, and there's no attempt to really quantify what's due to the internet. So.
Both agree.
That's right. Bob Gordon, would you like to come next? Thank you.
If somebody can
Jason?
Slide guy
find my
disappeared.
slide.
We'll find Jason.
He's AWOL.
While we're looking for a slide, maybe can I just add one element?
Yeah, of course.
Good.
I mean, so the story is that there are routine jobs, let's say assembly. You think of someone putting a tire on an automobile as a routine job, except when you think about the way Toyota did it in the 70s. So really, Toyota, had cognitive assembly line workers. They weren't really routinized, and that's why they took over. That's why they grew so quickly. So I find it very difficult to think of labeling an occupation like assembly workers in automobile plants as routine until you know the basis of how the firm is actually assembling the cars.
By the way, if anyone's interested, one of the people who worked with Toyota in structuring that cognitive, which we all know about just in time and so forth, was named Fred Emery. And Fred and his wife Marilyn, both of them from Australia, did some remarkable work in the 1970s to summarize this. I have Marilyn's PhD thesis and a book that they wrote together right here, which I also have scans of, if anybody here would like to see their scans. One of the last time that I've found that people have tried to think more comprehensively and therefore asking different questions which might require different data was probably back in that time period. There's very little, as we've heard today, which attempts to do that in the internet era, as best I can see. Sure. I get it. I got it. I got it. That's okay. That's okay.
First of all, I come from California. I used to affiliate with CITI and was trained as a labor economist here. I'm just wondering whether we should study the impact of internet or the impact of internet and some of the new media, even smartphones, because there's a booming of people using new type of phones, and that increased a lot of employment. Should we lump some those things together, not just technology? Thank you.
Professor Gordon.
How does this thing work? How do you advance the slides?
We just press page down.
You do it on the keyboard?
The forward button, it'll go.
Ah, okay, all right. Okay, relax, technology is going to destroy fewer jobs than you thought. The starting point for this kind of discussion is the book, The Second Machine Age by Brynjolfsson and McAfee, which predict loosely that half or more of the jobs in the United States economy are likely to be replaced by X, whatever this big technological revolution involves, within the next 25 years. So my straw man that I'm attacking is something that's really quite impossible and unbelievable, but we hear it so often that it's worth putting in historical perspective. If you're going to have jobs destroyed in a growing economy, then by definition, labor productivity, which is output per hour of work, would have to grow very rapidly. Hours of work would be shrinking, output would be growing, the ratio would have to grow rapidly. But productivity growth, in fact, has been remarkably slow over the last decade, and it's been even slower than that in the last 5 years. It explains the paradox that our recovery in the economy has been remarked on by everyone as being pathetically slow, 2.25%, 2.5% a year, but yet we're creating jobs at the rate of 3 million new jobs per year. How is that possible? It's possible because productivity has been growing so slowly. So for the future, I see much of a repeat of what's happened in the last 10 years, not the financial crisis, but the same overall pattern of slow, plodding productivity growth with no acceleration in sight. So let's just take a broader perspective to become a little bit more humble about what the internet has achieved. Here are 3 bars going back to 1890. The left-hand bar, which shows low productivity growth, is 1890 to 1920. The middle, the big successful period, 1920 to 1970, and then relatively slow again from 1970 to present. Now this is labor productivity growth. In economics, we don't link labor productivity growth to the impact of invention or innovation. Rather, we subtract off First of all, the contribution to productivity growth of education, shown by the yellow bars, and we subtract off capital deepening. That is equipping each worker with a larger quantity of capital. What is left is called TFP, or total factor productivity, and this is the economist's best measure of what innovation or invention is contributing to the economy. So to take Mark's challenge to us to talk about, isn't it terrible economists take technology to be exogenous? Indeed, economists reason backwards from TFP growth to say, okay, here's how innovation is affecting the economy, and lo and behold, because education and capital deepening were roughly of the same magnitude in each of those 3 periods, you have just this enormous, stark, huge difference between TFP growth in the middle period from the first period and the last period that we've been living through. To understand why, I'm going to go very briefly through this, you need to distinguish 3 industrial revolutions. The first one, steam, railroads, steamships. That boosted productivity throughout the 19th century. The second, the big industrial revolution, was the second industrial revolution, with the key general purpose technologies invented in the late 19th century, electricity and all of its spin-offs, internal combustion engine and all of its spin-offs up to air transport, entertainment, information communication technology, EICT, which in the second industrial revolution included telephone, phonograph, movies, radio, and TV. The fourth dimension was running water, sewer pipes to take away the waste, and the enormous reduction in infant mortality. The fifth dimension, chemicals and everything through antibiotics and the birth of modern medicine. And finally, the sixth dimension, the enormous improvement of working conditions, from steel workers sweating and straining, working 72 hours a week, until the much more pleasant set of jobs that we have today. The third industrial revolution is what this conference is about, the internet, and it has had major effects, but they've been channeled into one dimension, EICT, entertainment, information, and communication technology. And when we talk about the future, is the future going to be revolutionary? I challenge you to come up with a forecast that involves technology that's as important as what's happened in the last 40 years. The transition of TV from color to cable to time shifting to streaming. The information, the web, communications, the personal computer, all of those things are what we call the third industrial revolution, and as you can see, it just doesn't measure up in terms of productivity change. If we divide up the last 40 years into sub-slices, with each of the width of these bars shows you the length of the period, we see that we have 2 really good periods of productivity growth. At 50 years, between 1920 and 1970, marked in green for go, and then we had a brief period from the late 90s in the dot-com boom, where productivity also revived, but very slowly and very temporarily. In the last 10 years, you can see how slow things have been. So my challenge is to ask the question, might the primary productivity impact of the third industrial revolution be over? So I'm taking exactly the flip side of Brynjolfsson and McAfee. Far from speeding up, technological change is slowing down. And I'll just give you some categories. We can talk about this later. We had a complete transition in the office, the way offices all over the economy work, from typewriters and clunky calculating machines through personal computers, word processing, spreadsheets, the internet, web connections, and search. All of that, up to flat screens and broadband connections, was complete by 10 years ago. Virtually nothing has happened in office technology in the last 10 years. The same thing, transformation in retailing. We had the barcode scanner invented 30 years ago. We now have instant credit card authorization. That's about it. If you go in and out of a retail store, you're encountering the same technology that you did 10 years ago. Finance and banking, despite the invention of the ATM machine more than 30 years ago, we still have 97,000 bank branches and almost 400,000 bank tellers, again suggesting how slow is the replacement of human beings by machines that would seem to be superior in every way. And how long ago? These great seminal creations of the third industrial revolution are really quite ancient. Amazon in 1994, Google in 1998, and so on, up to the iPhone in 2007. So everywhere I look, I see stasis. I see things staying the same. And I play a game as I walk around New York, as I walk around Evanston, Illinois, or Chicago, or anywhere else, and it's called Find the Robot. You don't find the robot in the retail stores. I didn't see any robots in airports except for kiosks where you check yourself in, which were installed more than 10 years ago, and so on. So innovations continue, but how important are they? Yes, we are continuing to see positive productivity growth, and some of the things creating that are small robots, 3D printing, big data, artificial intelligence. Don't forget how much of that is going into marketing, a zero-sum game. On Bob Cohen's slides, you will see the word loyalty marketing or loyalty brand management. That's a zero-sum game. That's a huge investment of big data for something that inherently is not a social payoff. Just 2 slides to end. We can, using standard statistics, we can extract from US data the growth in potential output and productivity. That is, what is the economy's capability of growing at a steady 5% unemployment rate? The red line is output, the green line is productivity, the blue line are hours of work. And let me just, since the red line is the sum of the green and blue lines, I don't need to talk about the red line. Look at how America's capability to grow output has collapsed in the last 15 years. And that is a joint contribution of slower productivity growth, shown by the green line, and all of these components of the slowing growth in hours. That is, retirement of the baby boomers, slowing population growth, and the dropout of people, those displaced people in Len's slide from the middle of the income distribution. So what are the implications of slower output growth? This is my last word. We've got slower population growth, slower productivity growth. What does that mean? There are fewer profitable investment opportunities, which is going to feed back into even slower productivity growth. And we have some very unfortunate implications of slow growth that are going to come home to roost in the next 10 years. Social Security is going to run out of money before it's projected. Medicare is going to run out of money before the government's official projections. And so we're going to have a major adjustment through higher taxes and lower transfer payments. When you invite me to conferences, don't expect to be cheered up. And that's my message.
Thank you very much, Bob. Those of you who have checked this out probably know that Bob's book that takes his famous NBER article and expands it into a much broader discussion, I think is due out in September.
December, Princeton University Press. It's called The Rise and Fall of American Growth.
Okay, so
It goes back to 1870. So you'll get to visit Thomas Edison's lab and watch the electric light bulb be assembled.
I will only add at this point, for those who are not familiar with the work of Carlotta Perez and her late husband, Chris Freeman, at Sprue and other places, that she divides what Bob's just described as 3 industrial revolutions into 5 surges, but nonetheless the story is more or less the same, which is to say new technologies follow a logistics curve. They're an S-curve. And so you get the primary benefits in the sense that we're measuring them here in the beginning, and then they level off. And then, to answer Bob Gordon's challenge, the question is whether there will be another one. Carlotta doesn't do much work on that subject, and I've been talking with her for the past 10 years about that. Any more comments? We're still on time here. We've got time for Bob Cohen and maybe a few more comments from the panelists on what Bob Gordon's just presented. Hearing none, we're moving on to Bob Cohen.
Okay, so I'm going to take a different view, one of which is to say we really have to look at innovation in the internet to get an idea of whether there's going to be this third industrial revolution or not. And so one of the things I tried to put together is all of the innovations that are occurring. And I look at a whole chain for the internet, ranging from computing to storage to networking, et cetera. So I'm basically positing that what we're doing is moving to a software-defined economy. I think we really have to measure services different from the industrial base. And what I'm seeing is that in the future, an enterprise's competence, its competitiveness, and will be defined by its use of software, computing, and networking, that production will be commoditized, that we'll see the kind of increase in productivity that Bob says we won't, that I think that will raise economic growth above recent trend lines. And I think it will also begin to undermine traditional platform strategies because of the amount of transformation that will go on as a result of this. So what are the main innovations that are happening? One, since 2000, or actually closer to 2010, we've had the creation of the new IP, which is a new state-of-the-art virtualized IP network that employs software-defined networking and network function virtualization, that this is essentially the new architecture of the internet. It didn't work this way before. It's only worked this way in the last few years. And everything is beginning to move over to this, including all of the phone company infrastructure. So to say that this is not an innovation, I think kind of is shocking. We've also got the development of the whole OpenStack and open source software movement, which is creating an operating system that kind of moves over both computing, networking, and storage. We've got to move to things that are called blockchains, which not too many people know about, which is a way to shift from the single cloud structure that we've had up until now with the cloud to one that's much more highly decentralized and has a way to track every transaction that takes place, so that this would be a much more secure type of cloud for things like financial transactions, and it would have a built-in way to block any kind of ability to break in or to cause havoc with the network. We've also had two other things. One is containerization, which has created a very efficient way to ship resources from one place to another. That's really only been around since last year. And we've got a concept called fog computing, which is a response to the rise of the Internet of Things, about moving computing out to the edge. So these are 5 ways in which computing has been changed. And here's a couple of the changes that I'm talking about. The initial change that we had in computing data centers across the top is we had virtualization pretty much across. Next, we're moving to software-defined technology, where we can use this for computing, to restructure computing, to basically split the management and the data layer to make it possible to run computing and data centers and networking in a much more efficient way. This never existed before. We've also begun to automate programming. Just last week, there was an organization announced to promote P4, which is the ability to program data flows in a network. And that is something that, I mean, it was used for the early days of video communications. It's the basis for things like Videotron in the 80s. But this is the first time this is being applied to a data network. And we also have this effort to share resources, which is where the containerization and cloud computing come in. So what are some of the benefits here? I've gone through a few studies and provided some examples of what are the operational savings or the performance efficiencies, just to show that we're not talking about 2-3% change, and that we've got early adopters that are fairly well known. I mean, in the case of Walmart, just over the last 3 years, Walmart's developed a Walmart Lab they now take 70%, they said a few weeks ago, 70% of all sales from Walmart are done with a mobile device, either a mobile phone or an iPad or some other pad. So that we've begun to see a real transformation in the way in which major businesses use the internet. And I think that's going to have, where it's facilitating efficiency growth, I think it will have a positive impact. I think the problem is that nobody's really looked at these new developments in enough detail to give us the story, and I'm trying to do that over the next year or two. Here are some estimates just from GE that are linked to a 1% gain in efficiency, fuel savings primarily, and this is an estimate for the world, but I mean it's still coming up with something like 200 or 300 billion in estimated value over 15 years. I think this is relatively small. If the efficiency gains are 10 times this, the impact would be much more substantial. Okay, so what kind of jobs do these innovations start to create? If one looks at some of the older large firms and breaks down the employment numbers for them, I've used some estimates from Jigsaw, which has profiles of a lot of the workers. It's somewhat biased, but just to give a rough idea, I mean, what you're seeing is not that these firms are pretty much 80, 90% or more engineering, research, operations, and IT, but that a large part of the jobs that are created are sales and marketing or finance and administration. Enrico Moretti, in his book, estimates that the 12,000 jobs at Apple create 60,000 additional jobs in the San Francisco metropolitan area, 24,000 of which are not skilled. Okay, so what's some of the things that are related to these new innovations in the internet, and what's their economic impact? Here, this is about software-defined networking and talks about some of the benefits in terms of processes don't need to be or may need to be updated to adapt more quickly, but that there's a reduction in operating costs. So the lower chart here is from Verizon. One of the benefits that they had was they projected that as they went to these new technologies for running their network, they would basically change the costs and make Verizon much more profitable out into the future. That they had initially expected with the traditional infrastructure that their costs were going to run over their average revenues per user, not sometime in this decade. And the other one is a small chart from Google, where Google basically talks about its costs for running its network, and you can see that as they implemented SDN, which is the black curve, and got to 100%, that their costs of running the network dropped almost 90% from the original date. This is over about a 2 or 3 year time, so it's extremely short. The other thing that's an innovation is this OpenStack computing and networking, and this enables things like infrastructure as a service comparable to what Amazon has done. It gives us much more flexibility, and the interesting thing about this, which I think hasn't really been talked about in the meeting, is that what this has begun to create is essentially independent groups of programmers and engineers who work on creating new enhancements of this, that there are meetups and meetups and different types of group meetings that really refine this kind of approach to technology, and that it's something that's put up on things like GitHub, so that the intellectual property and the innovation is not really captured by a single firm. It's made available for everybody that wants to use it. Okay, and this is just a quick view of what blockchaining is. I think it's easier to look at my slides, but it's essentially moving from a single cloud out to this highly diverse cloud, one which is able to handle auto systems, banking, et cetera. Okay, and on the containerization that I mentioned before, there's some fairly interesting companies already using this, the Times, ING, GE Appliances, Orbitz, Grubhub. And it's basically a way to ship and make things shippable so that they're essentially exchangeable between different types of front ends and different types of infrastructure that need to be used on. And this is fog computing, essentially one of the first parts of the Internet of Things, where a lot of the computing and storage and other functions will be put at the edge rather than kept in a central place. Okay, so the other innovations that I'm seeing are two that are related to software delivery and software development. One of them is continuous service delivery based on microservices developing software as modules, and this is something that's really only come about in the last 4 or 5 years. And then essentially the Internet of Things with federating data, which I'll talk about a bit more. Essentially what's happened is that instead of having about 8 major steps in the development of software, we've begun to get kind of teams that work across these, but essentially teams that are using microservices that begin to change the jobs. So in companies that are doing this, the skill areas are essentially replaced with new cross-cutting skills. So you're no longer a DevOps specialist. You're now an engineer that's part of a team. So you're getting enhancement of the jobs that are already existing. And I think that's also changing the kind of skills required for jobs that are linked to that are supportive. And in this use of microservices, what's happening is that instead of putting things together in big blocks, you break them up into modular bunches, and that makes the software development is much more unstructured, so that new services can be developed and deployed much faster. So this really speeds up the time to move things into the cloud. And who's doing this? I mean, Amazon's doing it, Nordstrom, Homeland Security, Netflix, Condé Nast. And what I say here is that as Netflix talks about it, firms are able to know more about their customers because they have this data. They're able to really track things that are going on in real time, identify the kind of services that people want almost in a flash, and then figure out how to retain them. So I think that what they argue is that sales increase and loyalty increases and the cost to serve customers declines, as well as increasing the market. And then the other thing I've seen happening in healthcare is that as there's the initial implementation of the Internet of Things to capture data around, there's an effort to really link genomics much more closely to outcomes in healthcare treatment, so that what's become much more competitive is to really get your hands around the use and innovations with data. So what hospitals can now do is they can figure out that if they can treat someone using genomic data, that they can reduce hospitalization time by 15 to 20%. And they're using that reduction in hospital costs to basically finance developments in data, setting up data networks like the one in New York for all of the major hospitals, and also building individual data centers. So this is all creating jobs that I think many people had not really thought would be part of things. What I'm saying here is essentially that there's a lot of innovation going on, that it's had some major impacts on the kind of jobs that we're creating, that the story really needs to be examined much more closely, and that there is the potential for much more innovation in looking at the internet itself in some detail, which is, I think, what people haven't done. It's what I think if Brynjolfsson and McAfee had done this, maybe we'd have a better story that we could tell today. Because I think, as Bob said, there are the three dimensions of kind of automation, globalization, and the internet, and we don't know nearly as much about the internet as we know about the others.
Thank you, Bob, and we look forward to your further research on this. Do the other panelists have any comments? I saw Bob Gordon pull the microphone over, so.
Oh, just in case. I wanted to remind you that about 3 slides before the end, you saw the word loyalty. This market research to get to know your customer better may indeed lead to an ability to respond more promptly to consumer complaints. But we've gone through a 10 or 20-year transition away from human beings as customer service agents to phone menus that make it extremely hard to find humans. And so more power to any developments that will make customer service more user-friendly. I'm certainly all in favor of that. But the whole thing, including all of these pipe-shaped fancy diagrams, reminded me that much of the discussion here was about improving the plumbing of the internet, improving the way things go back and forth to the cloud. And much of that is invisible to the user. To put things in perspective, let me just mention 2 numbers. If we look at total GDP, the total spending on information communication technology, everything from smartphones to mainframes, is 7% of GDP, of which 3% is business spending and 4% is consumer spending. That, by the way, includes television sets. So we're talking about a small part of the economy. And when in the blue boxes, Bob mentioned that the savings were surprisingly small. I saw his slides in advance, and I computed it. The total savings on that slide were $275 billion over 15 years, which comes out at about less than $20 billion a year, which is barely 0.1% of GDP. So I think you have to keep in perspective the fact that much of this improvement in the efficiency with which the internet works is only going to have marginal impacts on what I was talking about, which is economy-wide productivity, a $18 trillion economy divided by 250 billion hours of work. There's an awful lot of that that's not being affected by this kind of internet plumbing improvement.
Len, did you want to make a comment? I'm sorry. Then we'll go to the whole audience. By the way, we have an extra 15 minutes, so we're not up against the hard stop. We've got 12:45. Thank you.
Well, I just wanted to add one other concept. When we're talking about labor productivity and we have output divided by labor, we measure labor pretty well. We have no idea how to measure output. I mean, as we move to, what's the output of a hospital? We know healthcare services are growing rapidly. How do we measure healthcare services? All the things that Bob Cohen was talking about, making healthcare better, how does that appear in GNP? I think one of the issues we really have to deal with, and why we think productivity may be falling, could be that we're not measuring output properly. We haven't seen, as we move to more and more of a service-based economy, because how do we measure output of hospitals? We measure like inputs. I thought it was supposed to be outputs. So that's, I think, something that we have to deal with and looking at these issues more thoroughly.
Can I just add to that, and then Bob, who I know has to leave, so that he can answer that. Then there's a part of the, and it's really good that you're putting this into a broad perspective, although I also still think and defend that one also can and should look at a specific innovation aspect, namely the internet, because it permeates so many other things, even if it gives you only part of the picture. But that there's a lot on the internet that is essentially outside of the financial economy, so measurable economy. There's a lot of voluntarism, a lot of services and information that simply are not kind of easily captured. Or there are some other things. I mean, let's say, even though I know that the example itself is trivial, but let's say, not to the individuals, let's say a dating service that greatly improves the productivity of people meeting each other. How does one capture things like that in your measures? And that's to continue Len's question.
I frequently hear the comment that oh, we're greatly understating the growth of GDP. Marty Feldstein had a Wall Street Journal op-ed about that either within the last couple of weeks. Yes, of course, we are understating the growth of GDP. We don't take account of the fact that our iPhone is both a camera and a GPS device and a phone and an email device and all the different kinds of machines that are combined in one little neat package. But I just wanted to remind everyone that we've always understated the growth of GDP. From 1910 to 1923, the price of a Model T Ford dropped from $900 to $265, and yet automobiles were not even part of the Consumer Price Index until 1935. All of the benefit to society of getting rid of horses and horse droppings in urban streets and the jobs to pick up after horses, all of that is completely missed from the measurement of GDP. You go back and it's Bill Nordhaus calculated that the benefit to society of the near elimination of infant mortality in the first half of the 20th century was worth all of the growth in every other aspect of consumption put together, because we had so many more human beings that were able to live a life of 60 or 70 years instead of dying at birth or within the first year of birth. So yes, instead of growing at 3% and slowing down to 2%, maybe GDP is growing at 4% and slowing down to 3%. The point is it's slowing down and the measurement errors have always been there.
We're going to go to questions now, but first let me thank the panelists for participating in this interactive exchange here. And let me thank Ellie for being very flexible and letting us do that. We've got now 13 minutes or so. Let me start with a question from Rob.
Okay. So, no surprise, I'm going to turn my point to Bob. You know, Bob, I feel like when I listen...
You have two.
Gordon, Robert Gordon. When I hear your comments on this, and then I listen to Andrew McAfee and Eric and all, I'm reminded of the light beer commercial, tastes great, less filling, because I think you're frankly both on too far aside there. And I've had a great fun hobby over the last year or so critiquing second machine age, which I think is just unrealistic, and there's no way what they say is going to happen. But I really do think that you underestimate part of what's going on here, in part because a lot of these effects take a long time to come in. Now, you mentioned, for example, CapEx is only a small portion coming. That's not really the right measure. CapEx has always been a small portion of the economy. Question is, of CapEx, how much is ICT? And of that, about 30%. And I think that includes buildings and furniture and cars and stuff like that. So if you just sort of say how much of it is of machines, you're over half of all machine or equipment is now ICT. And if you used price deflators the right way, you'd get an even bigger number. But I think just looking to your list of sort of the big six back in that second period you allude to, I think there's an enormous set of technologies now that are going to change all of those things. You mentioned retail. We've maxed out on that. I just heard a great presentation when I was in Silicon Valley of the head of Google, what's called Google flight or something like that. And I asked him, when are we going to have the first retail delivery from a drone? He said by the end of next year, which I thought was pretty optimistic, but it's certainly by the end of this decade, you'll start getting that. We'll see 3D printing. I agree, 3D printing is not going to be a mass thing, but you'll do 3D printing in your home to substitute for retail. And we still have modest penetration at best of self-service kiosk in stores, and that will just continue to use as people get used to them. So I think retail's, you're going to see continued improvements. Banking, I'm surprised you said that because we're in the midst of a fintech revolution here in New York, and fintech is just beginning, and it is going to fundamentally restructure banking. And New York could be a ghetto in 30, 20 years because fintech is going to take over. Medicines, again, I go to Bob Cohen's point, we're seeing the increased improvement of medicine, partly through rapid learning networks, customized medicine, which is all IT-based. Transport, and we're just at the beginning stages of ITS. ITS is going to have big impacts on transport. And then finally, higher ed. At some point, MOOCs are going to take off, and MOOCs will raise productivity in higher education. And lastly, data. I think the data revolution, yeah, maybe there's a lot of spending now on advertising, but the big benefits are going to be in things like logistics, healthcare, education, others. And the last point is, look, I think the reason we haven't seen as much is there's no government around the world that has had a comprehensive and aggressive digital transformation strategy. You have little pieces here, the Danes are great on health IT. China would be one. You get close there. And you get Lithuania with digital signatures, and you get Japan with ITS. But nobody's put it all together, and I think the tools are there if we put it all together, I would say, to certainly go back and double productivity growth.
Response from the panel? Thank you. Go ahead.
I'd agree.
Grab the mic, Bob.
I'd agree with what Rob is saying. I also think that what we have to do is really look at this chain that's part of the internet, figure out ways to measure it better. I think we don't, as Ellie was suggesting, we don't really have good measures for this part of the service and information economy, that they're really antiquated, that going back to the old use of ICT really doesn't mean ICT equals internet. That's not really true. So I think we have to figure out new approaches. I think when we look at productivity measurement, if we're considering software as capital now, there ought to be ways to include that in the way we look at productivity growth. And I think that, as I mentioned before, that we've really built up almost a infrastructure of skilled people who know how to use and create software, maintain it, and manage it. And we've had the growth of unicorn firms that are companies that reach $1 billion worth of valuation within the first few years of their existence. Some of them are doing this within the first 6 to 12 months. So there's a source of investment that is highly profitable. Otherwise, people wouldn't be investing in it. That's happening with your financial tech also. This year, there'll be double the number of investments in financial tech that there were last. So I think there's really a kind of momentum here. It doesn't show up in the numbers, but I think it will get there.
Jonathan Murray with UC Berkeley. So I'm probably the only person in the room who's had a foot in both of these camps, in the sense that I ran technology policy for Microsoft for 7 years. And for the last 4 years, I was CTO for Warner Music, using these technologies. And I will tell you that the technologies that you outlined will have a fundamental impact on employment in the IT sector. Because as we commoditize computing and infrastructure, and as companies deploy cloud, you're going to see a whole bunch of jobs that sit inside the enterprise today that will be automated. This is the same impact of automation that we saw in manufacturing being now applied to IT and other sectors that benefit from those services. So you will see, and this is to Rob's point, we may be seeing a delayed effect, but the revolution that's taking place in the deployment of technology today there isn't stasis in the evolution of technology and how it's being deployed to restructure industry. I have never seen in my 30 years as a technologist a level of change in the fundamental technologies that we're using and the disruption of those technologies at any point in my career. So I fundamentally disagree that we're seeing stasis in the way technology is having an impact, and I probably agree with Rob that what we're seeing is a delayed effect in terms of the productivity. And I'm not an economist, but I do know that we're not measuring the right things. So when we look at 10-year-old data sets about productivity and macro-level economic impact, they have no bearing on the reality of what's happening on the ground today. So economics needs to fix its measurement problem before we start talking about economists talking about the reality that those of us who use technology every day and restructure firms using technology actually see as a reality. That's my feedback.
When I used the word stasis, I applied it specifically to the operation inside business offices. I applied it to retailing. I applied it to finance. And I'm happy to have continuous improvement. My prediction is the productivity will continue to grow at 1.2%, which is not that different than the average for the last 40 years in which we had this complete transition from typewriters to the modern world. So I agree with you that there is lots of room for additional technology. We have to have it if productivity is going to grow at 1.2%. But don't say the data are out of date. We have data for the first quarter of 2015 that showed that productivity in the U.S. economy fell just as it did in the fourth quarter of 2014.
So Bob, I'm going to suggest you look at one case study. A company called Codelco in Chile, largest copper producer in the world, who embarked on a level of automation that's unforeseen in the extractive industries about 10 years ago, where they essentially put telemetrics and full automation into their mining process. They represent 40% of the Chilean GDP as one company, as the largest single employer in that country. The government, which owns Codelco, actually halted the investment in technology because of the fundamental disruption of labor in that industry and the political impact of going forward with that investment. That was a political decision. But the outcome of that investment was clear, that miners in bulk were going to be taken out of the mining process and replaced by high degrees of automation in that industry.
I think we should go on and hear from some other people.
Sounds like Sir Stafford Beer was in the room here for some reason. Last question from Rao.
Yeah, I just wonder, and I don't know whether it's a question or a comment, but in fact what we have here is that both parties are right, and it's a problem of microdata versus the aggregate macrodata. Every time I run the numbers at the macro level, I've never seen the needles swinging, and I want to agree with you. And at the same time, when I go to the case study data, particular industrial sectors, I see the differences. So in fact, the problem is that we might have all these changes you're talking about, but it's going to take a long time until we see some of those macro perspective numbers changing dramatically. That's one thing. The other thing is on the timing, on the lag. I think that the more we look at it from a management perspective is the lag is due to accumulation of intangible capital, changing of organization structures, training. I mean, in fact, offices, despite all these technology inputs, keep on working the same way they used to do with typewriters. People are doing very much the same things. So this is going to take time. And it's going to take time, and it's not technology driven, it's more organizationally and management discipline.
Last comments from the panelists before we go to Jeffrey Sachs.
One of the things we do see is real change in the way industry is using capital and using software as the new capital and using that to come up with services and applications. So I think one of the things we need to count a lot better is those services and the applications that are at the end of this. I haven't got enough of the story. I was really trying to show that there is innovation in the internet that's occurring, that's largely been occurring in the last 5 years, and that I would expect that as it's happening with Netflix, that this is going to transform other industries once it's really implemented, that we've had Netflix already affecting FCC decisions on mergers of the remaining large broadcasters. And I think we'll see further disruption in things like retailing and manufacturing. And I think that what will happen initially is you get this churn and disruption and displacement of jobs. But I think the potential, once these things start to really get appreciated and learned, is to generate a lot more jobs that would be saving of various costs that now exist in the economy.
Speaking as somebody who has been following this for a few decades, I think we got a lot more information and a lot more exchange today than even I would have hoped. I really want to thank the panelists. We're about to move on to something completely different.